I was using this quote by Gramsci, the theorist and activist, so to say, who in his prison notebooks says that a crisis is a moment where the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And a mausoleum, of course, gives you a place, a specific concrete physical space to say goodbye to the old and move on to the new. So I think it's also, I've tried to also create this kind of space where you could transfer from the old to the new and say goodbye to the Europe you once knew, or Project Europe as it once was, because it is collapsing all around us. And I think we need spaces where, especially when I started building it in 2013, the loss and the end of Europe was not so much talked about. We were still, all the academics I interviewed, the politicians, were talking a lot about crises, but they would overcome. In the end, Europe would prevail, etc., etc. Whereas I kept asking them this question, yeah, but what if it collapses? And then the reply was always, yeah, but it is not going to collapse. Yeah, but what if it collapses? Yeah, but it won't. Yeah, but what if it collapses? So you felt that there was this unwillingness to even consider the end. And I think if you really want to work on something, reconstruct something, change something, you have to be able to talk about the end in order to talk about a new beginning, I think. So I think to me it's really about proactively commemorating. It's about anticipating the disappearance of something that is still there in order to generate discussions, etc. So I mentioned this in the talk as well, but a mausoleum is, of course, just like a museum, an archetypical kind of what Foucault would call a heterotopia, so another space outside of society, in between dystopia and utopia, where you can think up new utopia. So I thought a mausoleum would be interesting. So a heterotopia literally means other space. So it's a space, you have different kinds of, or the way Foucault defines it, you have several kinds of heterotopic spaces. On the one hand, you have these other spaces which give, as he says, shelter to the imaginary, like a theater, like the one I mentioned in the talk as well, a children's playhouse or a doll's house. On the other hand, you have heterotopic spaces that give shelter to what society discards. So, for example, an elderly people's home, a cemetery, and what is typical of the heterotopic spaces is that they accumulate space. So you can have in a heterotopic space several spaces next to each other that in reality would never coexist. Like a museum, for example. If you go to a museum, you go from the ancient Greeks to the Middle Ages, and they're all together, all these different time zones and spaces are together in one space. That's the same in a theater play as well. If you jump from one action in one specific time period to another one weeks later or something, you're accumulating time. That's the classical notion of a heterotopic space. I'm not saying the notion is shifting, I'm just thinking that maybe some of the spaces are disappearing and we're creating new heterotopic spaces as we go along, I think. I have the impression that the classical heterotopias are moving more and more out of society. This I tend to agree with. Like elderly people's homes, we tend to really... Cemeteries as well, they used to be located, Foucault talks about this as well, they used to be located within the city, now they've moved to the outer borders of the city. Now we're even moving towards a phase where even funeral grounds are no longer places where people are buried, but you just have this tiny wall with lockers where you put the ashes. So we're slowly shifting to a space where that disappears as well. Yeah, so maybe even like all the questions around the theater, which is also an archetypical heterotopia. What is the position still of a theater within society? How that is marginalizing and marginalizing itself today. I do think it's like, I think the theater still has a heterotopic quality that we're rediscovering, I think.